Hello, my friends. Russia is standing firm on its negotiating positions. That should not surprise anyone paying attention. Moscow has been consistent at least since 2021, and you can trace the same line all the way back to 2015, if you like. Throughout this war, it is the West that has shifted, wobbled, or postured, while Russia has repeatedly stated the same basic terms. Europe talks about unity, but in practice moves around without ever really embracing negotiations. The dominant instinct in European capitals is not to seek a settlement, but to prolong the war and stay the course, no matter what that means for Ukraine itself. The Trump administration, for its part, vacillates between different positions. It is hard to know at any given moment where Washington actually stands beyond the usual slogans and self-congratulation. Yet, one way or another, this conflict will eventually be settled. It will end through diplomacy or through force, and the negotiations now emerging around Moscow are part of that trajectory. What matters is to understand what Russia is signaling, what the United States is really trying to do, how Europe is positioning itself, and why Ukraine's political chaos makes a comprehensive peace so difficult. Recent talks in Moscow between Vladimir Putin and Trump, envoys Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, have been widely presented in the West as peace efforts or exploratory contacts, with smiling photos and friendly atmospherics. But the reality is that this was not a session to haggle over minor details of a peace treaty. It was not a meeting to finalize territorial lines, reconstruction formulas, or legal clauses. It was a conversation in which Putin made absolutely clear again that Russia's basic demands are non-negotiable, that he does not consider Volodymyr Zelensky a legitimate president, and that any peace agreement must be signed with a lawfully elected Ukrainian leader who is not tied to neo-Nazi groups or extremist nationalist formations. Rumors that the West might bring back figures like Zaluzhny do not solve this problem. He is no more legally elected than Zelensky. From the Russian point of view, this is fundamental. There must be new elections in Ukraine, producing a government that actually meets constitutional standards and is not beholden to the same radical elements that plunged the country into this disaster. Only then, Putin has stressed, can there be a meaningful, legally solid peace agreement. Equally non-negotiable is Russia's insistence that Crimea, Zaporizhia, Kherson, Donetsk, and Luhansk are now permanently part of the Russian Federation. In his speech to the Russian Foreign Ministry on the 14th of June 2024, Putin stated this in blunt terms. Those territories have been incorporated following referenda and formal legal acts. Moscow is not going to hand them back. Not now, not later. Western commentators may dismiss this as maximalist posturing, but Russia does not see it that way. In Moscow's eyes, this is about existential security, not flexible bargaining chips to be traded away in some meet-in-the-middle real estate-style deal. Alongside recognition of these territories, Russia demands that Ukraine adopt a neutral, non-aligned, nuclear-free status, undergo demilitarization and denazification, and hold legitimate elections. NATO must withdraw from Ukraine. There can be no NATO bases, no NATO troops, and no de facto NATO command structures operating on Ukrainian soil. These positions have been stated repeatedly. Western elites pretend not to hear them, then feign surprise when Russia refuses compromise on what it has already said are fixed red lines. Many Western observers try to console themselves with the notion that these are just opening bids, deliberately maximalist. As in any negotiation, you ask for far more than you expect to get, then climb down later. That is not how Russia is treating this situation. The Kremlin sees the current confrontation as a matter of survival. NATO expansion, missile deployments, and the weaponization of Ukraine represent, in Moscow's view, an existential threat that must be neutralized either through a negotiated settlement on Russia's terms or through military means. That is why it is misleading to talk as if everything is up for discussion. Russia is saying, in effect, here are the points that are not open for debate. If you disregard them, the war will continue until we achieve our objectives by force. Western politicians either cannot or will not understand this. Instead, they cling to a fantasy that Russia is bluffing, that a bit more pressure will cause Moscow to fold, that fantasy is collapsing on the battlefield. The current stage of diplomacy is not about drafting the final peace document. It is closer to negotiations about how to negotiate. The meeting with Witkoff and Kushner falls into that category. Putin is using these contacts to make sure that Trump's team grasps the seriousness and inflexibility of Russia's position on core issues. This is also why the absence of Sergei Lavrov from that particular meeting is important. In public remarks, Putin has explained that when the core negotiating team, Lavrov, Medinsky, and Ushakov, sits down, that will signal the beginning of genuine, substantive, final stage negotiations. Until then, what we are seeing is preparatory, defining the framework, communicating red lines, and forcing the American side to confront the reality that Moscow will not bend on territory, NATO, or the legal status of Ukraine's leadership. The evolution of Russia's negotiating stance since the start of the war underlines this rigidity. In March 2022, during the Istanbul talks, Russia was willing to contemplate a settlement in which Ukraine remained territorially intact, provided Kyiv agreed to neutrality, guarantees for Russian speakers in the Donbass, and a halt to NATO encroachment. Under Western pressure, Ukraine walked away from that deal. The consequence was predictable. Russia's demands hardened. By June 2024, Moscow was insisting on full recognition of all 5 contested regions as Russian territory, the withdrawal of Ukrainian troops from those areas, and the same neutrality and denazification requirements. Putin has been explicit that if this offer is rejected, the next proposal will be harsher still. That is not rhetorical flourish. It reflects the fact that Russia's military and economic position relative to Ukraine has only improved over time. The balance of power is not ambiguous. By any serious metric industrial capacity, weapons production, economic resilience, debt levels, population, and manpower reserves, Russia has the upper hand. Russia's debt to GDP ratio sits around 19%, while Ukraine's has soared far beyond 100%. Russia's arms industry is turning out artillery shells, missiles, drones, and armored vehicles at a rate Kyiv cannot hope to match, especially now that Western arms deliveries are faltering and political support is eroding. Russia can finance and sustain its war effort without begging for money abroad. Ukraine cannot survive without constant external funding and weaponry. Yet Ukraine is not borrowing from a position of strength. It is leaning on Western states whose own economies are weakening. Germany, France, the UK countries, facing serious industrial and fiscal stress. Militarily, Russia is recruiting and training new forces, expanding its army and shifting to a war-capable footing, while Ukraine bleeds experienced troops, struggles to mobilize, and loses more ground. This imbalance is visible on the battlefield. Russian forces have taken key positions such as Pokrovsk and Mirnorod and are advancing steadily in Zaporizhia, closing in on the outskirts of strategic cities and consolidating control over major supply routes. Operations that Western generals once mocked as failures or stalemates have turned into clear Russian gains. Those who confidently predicted a long stalemate lasting to 2027 are quietly revising their forecasts. Some experienced defense officials now privately admit that the war could effectively be decided much sooner, perhaps even by the end of the year, not because Russia is invincible, but because Ukraine has been systematically hollowed out and the West has no coherent strategy beyond escalation and wishful thinking. On the Ukrainian side, political rhetoric has drifted into unreality. Kyiv's leaders insist on their own red lines. No recognition of Russian control over any Ukrainian territory. No restrictions on Ukraine's armed forces. No foreign veto over its choice of alliances. And a mantra that nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine, and nothing about Europe without Europe. These slogans might sound noble in Western parliaments, but they are detached from the military and economic facts on the ground. They resemble the delusions of the German leadership in April 1945, still moving imaginary armies on a map while Soviet troops closed in on the Reichstag. Ukraine does not enjoy any decisive advantage in any domain, economic, industrial, military, or demographic. The only area where Kyiv has excelled is in the information war. Narrative management, media theatrics, emotional appeals. Zelensky's latest statements about war profiteering and demanding that the aggressor must pay might play well on European talk shows, but they sit uneasily alongside revelations of massive corruption, stolen aid, and Western politicians and officials quietly pocketing funds routed through Ukraine. The corruption scandal is a critical piece of the puzzle. The removal or sidelining of figures like Yermak and other top aides is not a small housekeeping measure. These were Zelensky's key lieutenants, his left and right hands. Their fall strongly suggests that money flowed not only through Ukrainian networks, but also toward European and American elites. Reports that billions in aid have been siphoned off are not idle speculation. There are credible claims that members of the European Commission, national leaders, and dozens of U.S. lawmakers have benefited financially with sums in the tens of millions of dollars. It would be naive to think the money stopped at Ukraine's borders. We are already seeing former EU foreign policy chiefs charged with corruption. This is probably just the beginning. In such a context, Western leaders are extremely reluctant to allow full transparency or a comprehensive investigation. If the entire trail were exposed, it could devastate political careers in Brussels, Berlin, Paris, London, and Washington. That is one reason why Zelensky himself is likely to become a sacrificial figure, a convenient scapegoat to absorb the blame, while the real beneficiaries attempt to preserve their positions. Yet even disposing of Zelensky carries risks for his Western patrons. If he is pushed aside but left alive and free, he is in a position to reveal who paid whom, who authorized what, and how the network really worked. Eliminating him physically would pose its own dangers and would be difficult to disguise. Either way, the system has maneuvered itself into a corner. This is what happens when a war is sold to the public under false pretenses and lubricated with corruption, while the strategic rationale remains murky even to many of its own architects. Europe's political leadership appears even more adrift. Statements from figures like Mark Rutte and Ursula von der Leyen show a remarkable disconnect from reality. On the one hand, they speak endlessly about increasing defense spending to 3-5% of GDP, ramping up weapons production, and keeping Ukraine strong on the battlefield so it can negotiate from a position of strength at some indefinite future moment. On the other hand, in practice, Europe has made itself more economically fragile, more dependent on expensive U.S. liquefied natural gas, and more strategically exposed. Von der Leyen triumphantly proclaims that Europe has achieved energy independence from Russia because Russian gas, coal, and oil imports have plummeted. What she omits is that Europe has become dependent on more costly alternatives, has undermined its own industrial competitiveness, and has done little damage to Russia's overall economic health. Moscow simply reoriented its energy exports toward Asia and the global south, and now enjoys higher unit revenues in many cases. The net effect is that Europe is weaker, Russia is more resilient, and the political class in Brussels congratulates itself on a self-inflicted wound. Western officials like to repeat that Russia only understands the language of force. But the record of the last few years suggests that it is the West that refuses to listen to anything except its own propaganda. NATO planners spent decades conducting exercises in and around Ukraine, explicitly designed to integrate Kyiv into Western military structures, all the while insisting that these exercises were purely defensive and never aimed at Russia. That claim is as credible as saying a military drill on the Mexican border targeting unidentified forces to the north has nothing to do with the United States. Russia watched for 30 years as NATO expanded eastward, as the alliance conducted more exercises in Ukraine than in many formal member states, and as weapons trainers and intelligence networks seeped into every pore of Ukrainian military and political life. To pretend that Moscow suddenly woke up one morning and launched an unprovoked war out of sheer aggression is to ignore a long chain of provocations and broken assurances. The same strategic blindness is evident in Western talk about a broader war with Russia. Putin has repeatedly said that Russia has no intention of attacking Europe, but he has also been clear that if Europe chooses to start a war with Russia, Moscow is ready. Crucially, he distinguishes between the current special military operation in Ukraine and an all-out war. The former has not required full mobilization of Russian society or the economy. Life in Moscow Street, Petersburg, and other major cities continues with relative normality. There are no nationwide propaganda campaigns, no visible militarization of daily life, on the scale seen in World War II. If Russia were to declare a full war, it could mobilize millions of reservists, massively expand production, and target systems and infrastructure that it has deliberately spared so far, including ports like Odessa and key nodes in Ukraine's export network, which have remained functional partly because they serve the interests of countries in the BRICS and the broader global south. NATO leaders who talk casually about war with Russia, or preemptive strikes, or teaching Moscow a lesson, show little understanding of what such a conflict would look like, or how ill-prepared the West is to fight it. Complicating matters further is China's role. Beijing's control over critical materials like gallium, essential for advanced electronics and many weapon systems, gives it significant leverage over US and European arms production. China has already imposed restrictions that hamper Western capabilities. Together, Russia and China are building a strategic partnership that integrates economic, diplomatic, and military cooperation. High-profile meetings between Lavrov and Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi, filled with visible warmth and mutual confidence, send a clear message. These powers are aligning their interests, and they are not intimidated by Western threats. While Washington sends envoys to Moscow to explore possible deals, Russia deepens its ties with China and the global south, ensuring that it is not isolated and that any sanctions regime will be porous at best. Beyond Ukraine, the same pattern of overreach, posturing, and miscalculation is visible in U.S. policy toward Venezuela. The Trump administration has deployed thousands of troops and a substantial naval presence near Venezuelan waters, including aircraft carriers and other major vessels, while issuing ultimatums to President Maduro. The idea seems to be that a show of force will intimidate Caracas into capitulation, that Washington can simply flip a switch and change the regime. But the practical realities on the ground are far less favorable to the United States than the rhetoric suggests. Venezuela's terrain, dense jungles, high mountains, porous borders with Colombia and Brazil would make any ground operation extraordinarily difficult, more challenging in many respects than Vietnam. The Venezuelan military possesses anti-ship and anti-aircraft systems capable of inflicting serious losses on U.S. forces. This would not be a one-sided bombardment of defenseless targets. It would be a bloody, protracted conflict with no guarantee of success and enormous political and economic costs. At the same time, U.S. domestic policy on issues like the drug crisis is riddled with hypocrisy. American leaders talk about taking the fight to foreign cartels and promising to bomb or invade their way out of the fentanyl epidemic, while ignoring the role played by U.S. banks, corporations, and officials in laundering drug money and enabling the trade. The problem is not simply foreigners poisoning our youth. It is a system at home that profits from illicit flows and looks the other way. When political leaders grant amnesty or pardons to major traffickers or corrupt politicians on their own soil, and then promise to solve the drug crisis with more bombing campaigns abroad, their moral posturing rings hollow. You cannot kill your way out of problems that are fundamentally about money, corruption, and domestic complicity. Taken together, these dynamics, Ukraine, Europe, Russia, China, Venezuela, the drug trade, paint a picture of a Western system that is losing strategic coherence. The United States and its allies have overestimated their ability to coerce, sanction, and intimidate others into compliance, while underestimating the resilience and adaptability of their opponents. They cling to outdated assumptions about their own military and economic dominance, even as they hollow out their industrial bases, alienate key partners, and drive rival powers into closer cooperation. Russia, for its part, has been remarkably consistent about its objectives: demilitarize and denazify Ukraine, secure its borders, protect its new territories, and prevent NATO encirclement. It is prepared to achieve those goals through negotiation or through force, and it now holds most of the cards on the battlefield and in the broader diplomatic and economic game. We are at the end of the beginning, not the beginning of the end. The preliminary dance over negotiations about negotiations is underway, but the real music has not yet started. When figures like Lavrov, Medinsky, and Ushakov sit down opposite serious counterparts from the United States and a newly constituted Ukrainian government, then we will know that we are in the final act. Until then, the West can continue to talk about red lines, principles, and nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. But it cannot escape the consequences of the choices it has made. The war will end when the reality Russia has been spelling out for years is finally acknowledged, or when Moscow imposes that reality by force. Either way, the fantasy that the West can dictate terms from a position of strength is slipping away, and the longer it takes for that truth to be recognized, the higher the price will be for Ukraine, for Europe, and ultimately for the United States itself.